Hey everybody, this is Rabbi Maurice Harris, and this is a video about God, the G word, and Reconstructionist Judaism. The first part of this video is kind of an adult overview that I've put together, and then the second half is a little bit of a guide for teachers working with children in Reconstructionist communities. So let's get started. So you might have noticed, if you have spent some time looking at Reconstructionist liturgy, that there are a number of ways that our prayer books and other resources imagine and talk about God. You'll see lots of language describing God as a power or a force, as a living process, kind of a God in between, God as a part of nature, and God as a loving web of connection for all life. There's also images of God as the life source, the creative impulse that has led to all of existence, but also of God as the source of everything that's good or noble, the source of love, of truth, of courage, if that thing inside us that makes us take risks on behalf of the oppressed and the vulnerable and the needy, and stick our necks out. There's a Reconstructionist sense that mysterious force within is God, is God's presence. We also will think about and talk about God both as an intimate, internal feeling or presence, as well as the sort of mind-blowing mystery beyond our understanding. So we go deep within, and we also go, mind-blowing. And finally, one thing that our approach to God shares with all of the other movements of Judaism is that we're monotheists. We think of God as one, as a unity, but there's diversity within that unity, right? Many different peoples and religions and even individuals have different stories and teachings and metaphors for understanding God, the one. Here's a quote I really liked from Rabbi Arnie Rochlis in University Synagogue. God is a force within us and within the universe that leads us to be loving and caring people. I like this because this is something that I could imagine saying to kids, particularly, let's say, ages 7 and up, and then maybe immediately turn and ask them questions about their lived experience. When have they felt loving or other people be loving and caring? And have they felt that feeling inside them? God is a force within us. And have they sometimes noticed it all around them? God is a force within the universe. This is a lovely quote. All right, let's move on. There are some ways that in Reconstructionist liturgy we don't imagine God. We really don't imagine God as an old man in the sky on a throne. And we don't imagine God as a supernatural being. So we're not taking stories about miracles literally in the Reconstructionist movement. And kind of along those lines, we don't really imagine God as a being who literally does all the things that the Bible says that God does. So like where it says that, God rained down fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah, or that God flooded the earth and then, instructed Noah to take pairs of animals. Like, we're treating these stories as metaphorical, as sacred stories that our ancestors developed over time and then studied to try to understand things that are true about God, but not literal. This next one's important. We don't imagine God as a being who favors one religion or people over others. And that's why in the Reconstructionist prayer book, you see alternatives to the traditional Hebrew language that refers to the Jews as God's chosen people or treasured people. We think instead of God as a universal, loving force, and that every people can serve as true witnesses to God by developing themselves righteously and compassionately. So that's an important thing to know about our movement. We don't imagine God as a being who literally dictated the Torah to Moses. So that's a departure from very traditional Jewish beliefs. And I'll say more about what our beliefs about our sacred texts are later. And finally, this last one's important, I think, especially in working with kids. We really don't imagine God as a jealous or angry super person in the sky who rewards and punishes people. So we don't have like the big scary gonna get you God sort of in our portfolio of metaphors about God. So Reconstructionists tend to think about where people's ideas and stories and beliefs about God come from. And at least in Judaism, the traditional answer to that question for many, many centuries, and still in much of the Orthodox world today, the traditional answer is, well, our ideas and stories and beliefs about God come from God. God revealed them to Moses and spoke them to Moses, and Moses wrote them down, and now we have them in the Torah. So it's kind of a downloading metaphor, like up from the heavens, it gets downloaded down to humanity. A Reconstructionist take on this is kind of flipping it on its head. It's this idea that God is real, and human communities form religions and weave together stories and ideas and beliefs about God as a result of their lived experiences and their conversations and their intuition and stories that they've received from others, and that the ideas about God come from the ground up, the grassroots up. That's a very Reconstructionist take on things. And that doesn't mean that those ideas are any less sacred or beautiful or important. So, you've probably heard some people say, oh, the Reconstructionists, aren't they the ones who are atheists or don't believe in God? So let's just be really, really clear. No, that's not correct. A lot of times, the accusation of atheism is aimed at new movements in religious communities that change traditional ideas about God from one thing to another. So you can be talking about God, but you're talking about God in a really different way than maybe people did before. And so people are like, that's not God. And then you're like, yes, it is. And then sometimes people call you an atheist. What we believe is that our people, the Jewish people's ideas about God, have evolved and changed over time and will continue to do so. And I would add that in every generation, every historical period, the ideas that were the most widely believed about God amongst the Jewish people were ideas that made sense to people in their time and context, and that's appropriate, and that we too have the right and the responsibility to explore together in community ideas about God that make sense to us in our own time, and to know that in the future generations will probably change it up again. So, if you aren't convinced that throughout the history of Judaism, the ideas about God have evolved and changed, take a look at this next part of the presentation. If you start with the Hebrew Bible, right, we get a lot of images of God that could be captured by these particular images I pulled off the web, right? We kind of have this, old man in the sky, miracles splitting the Red Sea, and this last image at the bottom is one I found for Jacob wrestling God's angel, and in that story it's sort of not clear if that's supposed to be God's self or an angel, but just sort of pulling another image from this stockpile of images that our Western civilization is so saturated with, of sort of God up in the heavens, almost like a deity that you might have found in Greek mythology, except there's only one, and it's been sort of shifted over to like a Jewish context, or for Christians, a Christian context. Okay, so here's the thing. a couple thousand years ago, the first generations of rabbis were already changing up some of these ideas about God and moving away. So, as Rabbinic Judaism came to put the Torah at the center, and Rabbinic comments about the Torah and interpretations of the Torah at the center of Jewish religious life, rabbis started all arguing about what God was like. And some of them very immediately went to the place of saying, all those stories about God acting like a superhuman being up in the sky are metaphorical. And, other rabbis would disagree and say, no, they're not entirely metaphorical. But those debates became really, really live. And the rabbis also changed up a really important belief about God. Before the rabbis, there was the belief that God dictated the Torah to Moses. But then after the rabbis kind of became in charge of Judaism, I floated up a page of the Talmud here, the rabbis added to that belief, and they added that there was also a second Torah that God revealed to Moses, the oral Torah, which is kind of a nickname for all of the future discussions and debates that would end up being recorded in the Talmud and Midrash and rabbinic literature. So that was a radical new belief. And a lot of Jews at first who heard this didn't believe it. They were like, no, God, right? God gave Moses the Torah. Your commentaries are nice, but they're not also from God. But traditional rabbinic belief really asserted hard that all of their interpretations and everything that would become the Talmud and these other works of rabbinic literature really were divinely revealed by God. And so they gave us two Torahs instead of one. So that was another major change. Another major change, right? In biblical times in ancient Israel, if you asked people the question, how does God want to be worshipped? The answer would look something like this image, right? But after the Romans destroyed the Second Temple and the exile of the Jews 2,000 years ago happened, sacrifices were over and, in fact, became forbidden, and prayer and Torah study and deeds of righteousness and loving kindness replaced sacrifices, and that was a big change up in what rabbis and Jews thought was something that God wanted. Okay, moving forward on the timeline, one of the things Reconstructionism also observes about the evolution of God ideas in Judaism is that sometimes Jews have borrowed heavily from other traditions. So, maybe there for a while was this idea of kind of a God, the deity, up in the heavens, right? But then those ideas bump up against some of the philosophers from ancient Greece. And this particular image is depicting Aristotle's idea of God. And if you're not able to make heads or tails of this image, that's okay. All I can tell you that's important right now is that it is definitely a non-personified take on God. It's God as a flowing energetic force that spills out over itself and then keeps spilling out into outer and outer and outer and outer realms. That's what all these concentric circles are. They're actually spheres. And this image is trying to depict the whole universe and God's energy flowing through it. Well, guess what? Those ideas get incorporated into Judaism and become a central part of Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah, but also other parts of Jewish thought and philosophy. And this is just a single example I'm offering. There are lots of examples of how one of the things Judaism has been very good at is not only giving the rest of the world important ideas about God, but absorbing and modifying and making Jewish other groups of people's ideas about God. Okay, so let's stick with that idea. Very, very Reconstructionist notion is that in seeking to understand God, we should turn to many sources of information. So for sure, we should start with our own sacred texts, with the Torah, with the rabbinic teachings, with the prophets, with our prayers, for sure. But we should also take into account the sciences and the natural world. We should take into account the best insights and values that we can learn from others. We should pay attention to the truth of our lived experiences. And it's not something we just do on our own in an isolated way, thinking about God. Reconstructionism is really big on group work, on small groups, on small congregations and communities where Chavurot within larger congregations talking about this stuff and the learning that emerges from working together. In terms of Jewish beliefs from the past, you've probably heard this well-known motto of Mordechai Kaplan's, that in a Reconstructionist approach to Jewish teachings, the past always has a vote. Always has a vote. It means we have a duty to study the Torah and the Talmud, and or if we don't have the time to do that, to try and learn from someone like maybe our rabbi, a summary of the various teachings that have come out of Jewish tradition. But we also have to use our own consciences and decide together and be responsible for our decisions and the moral impacts of them. So, all right, trust me, we're a few minutes away from finishing up the kind of adult ed parts of this, but I want to say a few more things. So one thing that is worth knowing about a sort of classical Reconstructionist take on God is that it's an example of what some people would call a pragmatic theology. And that's because Mordechai Kaplan was really, really interested in the effects of a religion's teachings. He accepted right from out of the gate that all religion's teachings rely on stories and metaphors that we shouldn't take literally. And what matters the most is what kind of people do the teachings and stories of any religious tradition help us become? If our tradition includes teachings that we've come to realize lead us to cause harm, and that does happen sometimes in religion, then we're morally obligated to question them and think about how to reconstruct them. And the same thing goes for how we think about God. So I would also describe a typical Reconstructionist take on God as what I have come to call puzzle piece theology. And let me explain what I mean by that. I'll read this quote. All religions present us with different human communities' best efforts to understand God and truth, with a capital T. All religions are also imperfect, and their teachings about God include great wisdom alongside spiritual errors. No one religion has a monopoly on the truth. The religions of the world tend to discover some of the same core truths, like love your neighbor as yourself. But they also each have their own unique insights into the truth. So in order for human beings to get closer to understanding the truth, religions need each other because they all hold some of the puzzle pieces that will help fill in the whole picture. So this is my formulation of something Kaplan wrote about in many different ways and at many different times. This idea that we need each other, that religions have parts of the big picture, but not the whole thing. And that they make a mistake when they think they've got all the answers. So that's why I have these two quotes on the right-hand side of the page, and I'll just take a moment and let you read them if you wish. Okay, so having said all of that, whether you're in a Reconstructionist context or not, to describe God, we need to use metaphors. And the metaphors that we use are kind of like glimpsing the sparkle from one facet of a gemstone. Each person might feel connected more to some metaphors than others, or have their own unique understanding, and that's okay. I would say something distinctive about Reconstructionist congregations is that our prayer book and our rabbis are trained to sort of keep reminding all of us that the metaphors are metaphors. They're not the same thing as God. They're a finger pointing to an aspect of God. And if you've spent some time looking at our prayer books, you'll see that one of the ways that that gets played out is that throughout the Reconstructionist prayer books, wherever the Yud He Vav He Tetragrammaton, most holy name for God occurs in our prayers. In the English translation, you'll see that the metaphor for that name of God keeps changing and shifting, right? So, wise one, compassionate one, almighty, incomparable, the fount, the divine, the mysterious. By constantly shifting the metaphor around, the prayer book is trying to sort of open the door to people who have lots of different spiritual takes. And it's also trying to remind us that we shouldn't get overly attached to any one of these metaphors. So I can imagine some of you 25 minutes into this video saying to me, "This is all fascinating, Maurice, and it's very heady. But how do we handle God conversations with children?" I'm so glad you asked. There actually are some fantastic examples out there, especially in the children's book arena. If you haven't gotten yourself a copy of In God's Name by Rabbi Sandy Sasso, I think you owe it to yourself. Even if you don't use it in the classroom, it will really, more quickly than this presentation, drive home a Reconstructionist take on God. She also has other fantastic books. One of my favorite is God in Between, which is a children's story that ends up teaching the idea of God as like a force or a power that's in the space in between people when people are doing good things to each other, which is not the easiest idea to get across to a small child, and yet she manages to do it. Another book that I really like, written by Rabbi Larry Kushner and Karen Kushner, is called Because Nothing Looks Like God. So let me just jump back for a moment into In God's Name by Sandy Sasso. And she doesn't know that I'm plugging her book. But I've just screenshotted a few pages from this book, and you'll kind of get the idea, right? So this is a book that sort of introduces us to lots of different people and tells us how they name God. So, right, so the farmer calls God source of life. This girl whose skin is golden as the sun calls God creator of life. The tired soldier calls God maker of peace. And it goes on in this manner. And then at the end, she brings us back to the idea that all of them are able to call God one, or that God is one, even though they all call God by these different names. So there are ways to kind of bring these ideas to an age-appropriate level, and I highly recommend these particular resources. I'm also interested in sharing with others who teach in Reconstructionist congregations resources that you may have. So now we've come to the part of the presentation where I'm going to share some of my tips about teaching God in Reconstructionist communities. And I would say that more important than anything else a teacher in one of our religious schools can do is we should make sure that what we teach about God helps people. And how does it help people? It's crucial that what we teach about God help people be the best human beings they can be. It's crucial that what we teach about God help people be honest about what we can know and what's actually mystery. That what we teach about God should help build bridges of respect and love with people of all faiths and backgrounds. It should help people feel that they are loved and valued just as they are. It should help us be more open-minded, not less. And this last one's really important. What we teach about God should help people, should help children feel a sense of existential security. What does that mean? The way I define existential security is this feeling deep inside that despite all the things we don't know, like we don't know what happens when you die. We don't know what happened before you were born. We don't really know how the universe got created. Despite all those things that we don't know, we can cultivate a sense of trust that the universe and God, however we understand it, holds us and loves us, and that it's safe to live, and it's safe to feel, and it's safe to die. And that's existential security. So you don't have to be a rabbi or a theologian to sort of be checking whether the way that you're presenting God sort of meets this checklist. So now I've got sort of a 10 commandments kind of thing, sort of like Maurice's 10 tips about teaching God to kids in a Reconstructionist synagogue. You're welcome to print these slides out if that is helpful. I'm going to just go through them and then we're done. So number one, we take the Bible seriously, but not literally. So there's lots of ways to navigate that with kids at different ages. When I was teaching and doing things like, like, I don't know, youth Shabbat services, and if a child who is maybe in kindergarten or first grade would ask, well, did that really happen? What I would try to do is respond at an age-appropriate level. I would say, well, I wasn't there, but this story was so important to our ancestors. And if they were sharp and could tell that that was a dodge, then what I would actually say is, I don't know. I don't know exactly what happened in the creation of the universe, or I don't know if the sea actually split like that, but what I do know is that something amazing happened to our ancestors, and they gave us this story. And you can kind of work with that. You don't have to kill the sense of wonder or sacredness or beauty in myth and mythic power, to also be honest that we take the Bible seriously, but not literally. Okay. When we say that God is one, right, this is kind of like a teaching that I have for when we talk about the Shema, right? What we mean is that there's one loving force or power that connects and loves everyone, and that God helps us be the best people we can be. Honestly, if you took just like number 2 alone, you could kind of run with that as your North Star, as your guiding light. All right, in a Reconstructionist community, this is really important. We strive to use gender-inclusive God language, and language that transcends anthropomorphic metaphors in age-appropriate ways. So that doesn't mean shouting down a child who refers to God as he, right? It means we're pointing in a direction. We recognize that kids get all kinds of inputs about God language, and it's not our job to police them. It is our job to teach and model. So, it is important to change up pronouns in talking about God, or when the kids are old enough to get it, to say, well, lots of rabbis going way, way back have talked about how, in a way, it kind of doesn't even make sense to say he or she or they or it about God, because God's kind of mind-blowing and beyond all of that. You know what I mean? What do you think? Right? So we're trying to make sure that everybody's able to see a bit of themselves in God. We teach that at different times our ancestors have believed different things about God, and that we right now, the kids in the classroom and me, the teacher, we get to be the newest link in that long chain of conversations and ideas about God. This is something I love about Reconstructionism. It's the idea that a healthy form of religion is to be a participant in a tradition, not a blind follower, but a participant, an informed participant, but a participant. Okay, number 5, we teach that Judaism welcomes different opinions about God. And this one's important. Everyone still belongs to the Jewish people, whether or not they believe in God, or whether or not they believe the same thing that you do about God. The belonging part comes ahead of everything. First and foremost, we start the conversation about Judaism by talking about the Jewish people. That's a very Reconstructionist framework. Okay, we're almost through. This is really important. We teach respect for other religions' beliefs and appreciation that we live in a world of such religious diversity. And we teach that God loves all peoples and religions equally. This is really important. No matter how challenging a Hebrew school environment can be, no matter how rowdy or rambunctious or tired students might be, there still is this opportunity to model and repeat and represent some core values. And this is one of them. That this is an important teaching, and this is a teaching the world really needs. Okay, we teach that when people use beliefs about God to cause harm or to express hatred, they're making a terrible mistake. Okay, this is an important thing to teach, and it can be worded and phrased in a bunch of ways. But sometimes, especially when something really bad happens in the world, like a terrorist attack that's done by someone who thinks they're acting in the name of their religion, this is an important thing to teach. And it's not just for those extraordinary violent events. It can be something that's not going to get reported on in the news. I mean, when I was growing up, I had friends who were of another faith tradition and who, would tell me about how they were being taught that if they didn't believe X, Y, and Z, that they were going to go to hell and suffer forever. Well, a Reconstructionist perspective would look at that and see that as a belief about God that's causing harm to children. And that's teaching them something that's not true, and that this is a mistake. So just want to put that out there. This is an important part of how we approach this whole topic. This is what I would call the Mr. Rogers rule. We teach that it's okay to have different feelings towards God at different times, including anger and disappointment. Judaism allows questioning and even arguing with God. I mean, there's some great stories you can showcase to point that out. So this is also important. It's okay for the teacher to say, I don't know, or I'm not sure what I believe about that, if that's the truth. We can model for kids that it's okay to not have all the answers. That's really all right, and that's a part of this idea that their security that they belong to the Jewish community, to the Jewish people, is not resting on whether they've got the right belief running like a repeating looping tape in their head. They're being part of the Jewish people is rock solid, and it's assumed that their ideas about God might change, or that they may not know what they feel or think in any particular moment. So that leads to this last one. We teach that it's likely that each child will have different ideas and questions about God throughout their lifetime, and that's okay. Being Jewish means being part of a community where you can talk and even disagree about those things while still belonging. You still belong. I just want to thank everybody for taking the time. I know that this was this is almost a 40-minute long video, and that's a long time to be plugged in. I really hope this is helpful. Please know that all of us in the Department for Thriving Communities at Reconstructing Judaism are here to try to help. We have a fantastic team. We have a number of people with experience working in religious school settings, and we're also connected to lots of people who are, knee-deep in this world. And remember, this is about doing the best one can, and about loving, supporting, and nurturing kids, and looking for healthy ways to support them to feel good about themselves as they have interesting conversations about God with you and with others. So I'll sign off for now, and hope that this is a helpful resource. Bye-bye.